Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five.
Well, an astonishing admission this week by General Lloyd Austin, the head of U.S. Central Command, about just how ineffective the administration program has been to train Syrian rebels to take on ISIS. Incidentally, on Friday, the Pentagon said the number of trained Syrian fighters has now jumped from 5 to 9. And we're back now with the panel. President Obama had a $500 million program, $500 million to train Syrian rebels. After spending $40 million, we now have, it turns out, 9 trained Syrian rebels in the field. And the administration announced this week, well, they're going to change strategy. Is that a good idea?
I think so, because the chickens are coming home to roost on the current strategy, not just as regards the battle against ISIS, but the overall Syria policy. And here we have an excellent example of what happens in the world, in far-flung places sometimes, when the United States is not involved in leading. In Syria, the United States appeared the president was going to take the lead. He said Assad must go. He was prepared to mount an attack to deter the whole chemical weapons program. And then he just stopped short of that and turned it all over to Vladimir Putin, whose influence in that region is growing and is bound to be malignant. And we're seeing on the shores of Europe the consequences of the mess in Syria. Tragic circumstances, people dying in boats and elsewhere in significant numbers. It's a terrible mess, a humanitarian crisis. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the utter failure of the ISIS strategy.
After General Austin's testimony in Congress about the 4 or 5 fighters, now up till 9, the White House actually tried to disclaim responsibility for its own program. Here is White House spokesman Josh Earnest.
Many of our critics had proposed this specific option as essentially the cure-all for all of the policy challenges that we're facing in Syria right now. That is not something that this administration ever believed, but it is something that our critics will have to answer for.
Kirsten, I have to say, in roughly 40 years here in Washington, I have never heard that line of argument from the White House podium. We never wanted to do this. Right. You made us do it, so now it's your fault. Yeah, well, it's a terrible argument. I think that they were never on board with this idea, and because they were never on board with this idea, they shouldn't have done it. I mean, that's the answer. It isn't that we went ahead and did something that we thought was a bad idea. Is a terrible argument, and I think that they were right the first time. I don't think it was a good idea. I think that the whole policy is incoherent. The idea that we're going to get rid of Assad and fight ISIS, well, they're enemies, first of all. If Assad leaves, there's no clear replacement. ISIS would be the obvious choice to move in. And so when you look at the situation, there really aren't good answers. The people who are telling them, send in the rebels, arm the rebels, arm the rebels, well, I don't think it's that surprising that it's turned out the way that it's turned out. And in fact, the Pentagon has said they've had the difficulty finding people who want to fight ISIS because they want to fight Assad.
The president has spoken up for this program. He's defended it. He said it's the best way. So was he lying the whole time about what he really thought about it? I hate to say it, but apparently so.
I think it was a political decision. That's what I think. I don't think he ever bought into it.
Meanwhile, this week, another more alarming news. The Russians have moved in fighter jets, attack helicopters, tanks, armored personnel carriers into Syria. And after saying that they were going to isolate Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, the White House, the administration, is reaching out repeatedly to Russia. Here is Secretary of State John Kerry.
I spoke to Foreign Minister Lavrov again yesterday, the 3rd time in less than a week. I made clear that Russia's continued support for Assad risks escalating the conflict.
Karl, a couple of questions. Whatever happened to our isolation strategy towards Putin and Russia after the Ukraine invasion? And secondly, is Russia now filling a vacuum in Syria that we left for them?
Yeah, well, following the expulsion of the Soviet advisors from Egypt in 1973, Russia, the Soviet Union, and then Russia have been out of the Middle East. And by the feckless foreign policy of this president, they're back in. 1,492 days ago, President Obama said Assad must go. 3 years and 1 month ago today, He said if they use chemical weapons, it's a red line. If he had moved to remove Assad at either one of those points, two things would be a reality today. ISIS would not be in control of a great swath of Iraq and Syria, and Russia would not be reemerging as an influence in the Middle East. Now, you mentioned a lot of equipment when you went through there, the Su-27 flanker fighter bombers and tanks and so forth. You didn't mention one thing, the Au-22 surface-to-air defense system that the Russians have now put in Syria. Now, last time I looked, ISIS doesn't have an air force. That is a clear and provocative gesture towards the United States saying, we will determine what happens in Syria, not you. You interfere from the air. We have surface-to-air missiles which can take out your equipment. It is astonishing what a place of weakness we have found ourselves in by this administration's mishandling.
And meanwhile, you have Kerry reaching out to his counterpart, and you have Ashton Carter, the defense secretary.
Begging for them to talk to us, which says, we don't have a strategy. We're hoping they'll give us a strategy. We ought to be stepping back and figuring out what is in our best interest and what is the way for us to go about both degrading ISIS and removing Assad from power, which this administration has declared as its goals.
Chuck, I don't mean this as a trick question, but can you explain what the U.S. policy is now in Syria towards Assad, towards ISIS, towards Russia?
No, I really can't. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different contradictory goals, and in fairness, you know, you have evil people on both sides, neither of which we want to triumph. But I guess I agree with the rest of the panel. Even with all those difficulties, they played that weekend very, very poorly. And now, on top of everything else, Vladimir Putin is going to get an opportunity to launder his image internationally as the guy coming to ride to the rescue against the Islamic State. That's how he's going to spin this support for Assad as like the blow that will be struck against Islamic State. And all the stuff about taking over the Crimea and everything he's done in Ukraine will go by the wayside. This guy has used Syria to destabilize an arc of the world going all the way from the Middle East into Germany, because it's because of his support for Assad that the war was prolonged and all these refugees were forced out of the country. It's extraordinary.
Well, and President Obama's feckless. Let's not forget that.
Okay, duly noted.
How could we?
Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday.